A day in the life of Bob the clumsy detective. Bob wasn't just a detective, he was the detective. Well, sort of. He worked in the smallest precinct in the city, and if you ignored his tendency to accidentally spill coffee on every case file, trip over his own shoelaces, and mistake a sneeze for a gunshot, he was actually quite the legend. Or at least, he thought so. One Tuesday morning, Bob's boss, Captain Finn, walked in, already looking like he needed a vacation. Bob was munching on a donut, or at least he was until he tried to talk, and the donut slipped out of his hand, somersaulting to the floor. "Bob, we've got a high priority case," Finn said, watching the donut roll under a cabinet. "And no, it doesn't involve finding the donut." Bob saluted, knocking over a coffee cup. "Got it, boss. High priority. Very serious. Super detective mode activated." Finn groaned. Just, just listen, okay? A wealthy woman's dog, Mr. Boodles, was stolen last night. She's offering a reward of 10 grand. Bob's eyes widened. 10 grand? For a dog? Must be one handsome pooch. "Focus, Bob," Finn said, rubbing his temples. "Head to her mansion, get details, and please don't mess this up." At the mansion, Bob arrived at Mrs. Vanderblossom's mansion and was greeted by a butler who looked like he'd been vacuum sealed into his tuxedo. "Detective Bob, Madam is awaiting you in the parlor." Bob followed, marveling at the mansion's luxury. The floors were so shiny he could see his own reflection. Well, until he walked into a decorative pillar and almost fell over. Mrs. Vanderblossom was a tall, regal woman who looked like she'd rather be doing anything else than talking to Bob. "Thank you for coming, Detective." "Bob. Detective Bob." He gave a firm nod, and then promptly knocked over a priceless vase with his elbow. Mrs. Vanderblossom sighed. "Yes. Well, my poor Mr. Boodles was stolen. He's my precious little darling, my one and only. I simply must have him back." Bob pulled out a notepad, licking his finger before turning the page. "Let me get the details here. Last seen? Yesterday evening. He was wearing his little tuxedo and his favorite bow tie." "Got it," Bob said, scribbling down tuxedo dog. "Did he bark or leave any clues behind?" Mrs. Vanderblossom tilted her head. "He's a Chihuahua detective. He doesn't exactly leave clues." Bob nodded, pretending to understand. "Right, no clues." Interviewing the staff. Bob decided it was time to question the mansion staff. He started with the cook, who was chopping onions with the precision of a samurai. "Ma'am, did you happen to see any suspicious activity around here?" Bob asked, trying to look authoritative, but his stomach betrayed him with a loud growl. The cook raised an eyebrow. "You hungry, detective?" "Uh, maybe a little." She handed him a sandwich. Bob took a bite and immediately coughed. Extra spicy mustard. "Wow, that's got some kick," he said, fanning his tongue. The cook smirked. "That's just mayonnaise, detective." Next, Bob talked to the gardener, who was meticulously pruning a bush shaped like a flamingo. "Any strange characters around here lately?" Bob asked, leaning against a nearby tree, which promptly shook a bird's nest down onto his head. No, sir. Not unless you count the occasional squirrel." Bob nodded solemnly. "Squirrels, eh? Suspicious little guys." Bob's next move was to identify suspects. So he did what any professional detective would do. He made a list of everyone who could possibly dislike Mr. Boodles. Topping the list was Mrs. Vanderblossom's nephew Freddie, who apparently hated the dog with a passion because it once bit him on the nose. So Bob set up a meeting. Freddie was a lanky teenager, more interested in his phone than in talking to Bob. "So Freddie," Bob began, leaning forward conspiratorially, "where were you the night of Mr. Boodle's disappearance?" Freddie shrugged. "Uh, playing video games?" "Also, who cares about that rat?" Bob gasped. Sir, that's a Chihuahua, not a rat. Big difference. One fetches, the other, uh, runs. Freddie rolled his eyes. Whatever, man. I didn't touch him. Bob squinted. We'll see about that, kid. We'll see. The breakthrough. After hours of investigation, and by that I mean Bob losing his car keys twice, almost spilling his entire notebook in the fountain, and getting sidetracked by a food truck, he had an epiphany. Mr. Boodles wasn't stolen. He had escaped. After analyzing all the clues, like the missing food from the trash can and the open back gate, it all clicked. He ran away, Bob declared proudly to Mrs. Vanderblossom, possibly to get some fresh air or meet other, dog friends. Mrs. Vanderblossom looked horrified. Meet other dogs? My Mr. Boodles? Unthinkable. Bob sighed. Ma'am, with all due respect, even high-class dogs need friends. The resolution. In a dramatic twist, just as Bob was about to give up, Mr. Boodles was found at a local cafe, begging for scraps. Bob personally returned him, complete with a new bow tie. Mrs. Vanderblossom was overjoyed, and Bob, now $10,000 richer, left the mansion feeling like a hero. Well, until he tripped over a potted plant on his way out. So, Detective Bob solved the case, recovered the dog, and even got himself a fancy steak dinner with his reward. But he wasn't in it for the money. No, no. He was in it for the thrill, the donuts, and the questionable sandwiches.